Chapter 4 is called The World as Percept, and now he's going to take our attention in a slightly different direction. First of all, he says concepts and ideas arise through thinking. Now, ideas is new. Ideas are new and on the board, but qualitatively he says concepts and ideas are not that different from each other. He says ideas are richer, more saturated concepts. Yeah? Now, actually, in another place, Rudolf Steiner uses Immanuel Kant in a way that he agrees with Immanuel Kant. He rarely agrees with Immanuel Kant, but he does agree with Immanuel Kant in the way Kant approached the phenomenon of thinking. So I'm just going to do a quick diagram here. Kant said thinking consists of two activities. And he says one activity, the first activity, is the intellect. And the purpose of the intellect is to take something and to distinguish the parts. To take something as a whole and to name, to separate by shade or color or edge or nuance, to name, to distinguish each of the different parts and to name them. Yeah? So the intellect makes distinctions. It takes the fabric of the world and says there is an easel, there is a piece of art, there is a beautiful quilt hanging on the back of the wall, and that quilt consists in fact of 5 by 7 squares, and each of the squares is multicolored, and I can name the one in the lower left and the one next to it. I can name the specific colors of every piece of it, yeah? So the intellect makes distinctions. It takes the whole and names each individual part, makes distinctions and names each part. And friends, this is what we're taught in school, isn't it? Name the 50 states and their capitals. Can you? Names each part. Yeah. So he says, actually, the product of the intellect is one activity of thinking. It's to make distinctions and to name, to make distinction and name each part. Yeah. Name each part. However, you could say, he says, what that activity does, it produces a concept. Each part that you have distinguished and named, you've done so by forming a concept. So the product of the intellect is a concept. You with me? Mm-hmm. The red square versus the green square versus the blue square versus the turquoise square. Yeah? So the concept is an individual. I've taken the whole, I've named each distinctive part. Now, we're all taught this in school to extreme. However, the second part, we're not taught in school, or we're not very well taught in school, unless it's a Waldorf school. And the second activity, he calls reason. Now, what does reason do? Reason takes the parts that have been distinguished by the intellect as concepts, and it reunites the parts into a living whole filled with understanding. Yeah? So we could say, so reason is the reuniting, either the reuniting or the uniting, or the uniting of concepts, yeah? Into a greater whole. And the product of that is the idea. Beautiful. He's absolutely right, yes? Mm-hmm. So we could say, I see a bunch of colors and I can name each square. Now, what's the idea, you see? So I can, through my intellect, I can distinguish and name each part. But now the question is, I stand back and I say, so what does that mean? You know, what is it? What is that? Not piece by piece. What is the whole thing? That's the idea. So when he says ideas are only richer or more saturated concepts, we could say ideas are, in a certain sense, the ideas would contain a whole sets of concepts underneath them. The other thing about concepts, of course, is that the concepts are often, they're permeable. Yeah. So we all know the story about the blind men who came to an elephant, and one grabbed the leg and said an elephant is a big tree trunk, and another one felt the side of the elephant and said the elephant is a big wall, and another one grabbed the tail and said that the elephant is a rope, and the other one grabbed the trunk and said the elephant is a serpent, is a big snake. But of course that would be the concept, yes, the four different points of view, without a view, the four different experiences, naming each particular experience. But only if you stand back do you realize that all of those different experiences belong to one idea, elephant. Yeah. The elephant is really the idea, or you could say the assemblage of all those individual parts. So that's what the idea is. The idea consists of a whole series of concepts, but they're related in a lawful way. Okay? So, in that sense, so he's saying concepts and ideas arise through thinking. Now, words cannot say what a concept is. Words can only make us notice that we have concepts. Fascinating. Yeah? I can't define a concept, but in my use of words, I'm letting you know that I have them. Unless my words are nonsensical. And even then, there may be concepts connected to them. So words can only make us notice we have concepts. So he says, when we see a tree, our thinking reacts to our observation. A conceptual counterpart joins the object, and we consider the object and its conceptual counterpart as belonging together. When the object disappears from view, only the conceptual counterpart remains. That is the concept of the object. What remains after we've observed the object and thought about it is the concept. Now he's going to condition this later a little bit differently. The wider our experience extends, the greater the number of concepts. But the concepts by no means stand apart. They combine into a lawful whole. Organism, the concept of organism, combines with other concepts such as lawful development and growth. Other concepts formed from individual things collapse wholly into a unity. Thus, all the concept I form about lions combine into the general concept, lion. In this way, individual concepts link together in a closed conceptual system in which each has its particular place. Ideas are not qualitatively different from concepts. They're only concepts with more content, more saturated, and more inclusive. I emphasize here that it is important to note at this point that my point of departure is thinking, not concepts. Steiner's beginning point is not concepts, but the activity of thinking. Concepts are gained by thinking. Concepts and ideas already presuppose thinking. What I said about thinking is that it rests within itself and is determined by nothing. That can't be transferred to the concepts. The concepts are the product of the thinking activity. I note this explicitly here because this is where I differ from Hegel, who posits the concept as the original, as the origin of things, first and original. Now he says concepts cannot be won by observation. Why can't they? What do you have to do to produce a concept? You have to think. So staring at something won't produce a concept. Only when you think about what you're staring at will you produce a concept. Yeah? Now, he says this can be seen from the fact that children form concepts for the objects in their environment slowly and gradually. Concepts are added to observation. Now he goes through a nice step with Herbert Spencer, who gives a very generalized description of walking through a field and hearing a noise, and you wonder, and it says, so then he says, and you look and you see that there's a partridge in the bushes. Yeah. And then Spencer tries to take this experience apart and describe what actually happened. And Spencer says, because in life we have countless times experienced a disturbance in the peaceful state of small bodies, that it accompanies the movement of other bodies located among them, and because we have therefore generalized the relationships between such disturbances and such movements, we consider this particular disturbance explained as soon as we find that it represents an example of this relationship. That's an awful lot of words that don't really say very much in a certain sense. So Steiner says, examine more closely. The situation looks quite different than this description suggests. When I hear a noise, I hear a sound, I first seek the concept. I seek the concept that fits the observation. I hear a sound, okay? There's a sound. Immediately the question is, what is the sound? I'm seeking the concept for that sound, yeah? Now, someone who thinks no more of it simply hears the sound or the noise and leaves it, not interested. Yeah. But by thinking about it, it becomes clear that I must regard the noise as the effect. Yeah. Now I'm brought into the idea of cause and effect. That noise is produced as the effect of something. Now the question is, what is it caused by? Yeah. So observation is triggering thinking. My thinking is engaged. If I hear a noise and I'm not interested, I'm not going to bother. But if I hear a noise, I'm going to say that is the effect of something moving. The question is, what is it that's moving? So, only when I combine the concept of effect with the perception of the noise am I inclined to go beyond the individual observation and seek a cause. The concept of effect evokes the concept of cause, and then I seek the causative object, which I see in the form of a partridge. I can never gain concepts of cause and effect by observation. Observation calls forth thinking. And it is only thinking that shows me how to link one isolated experience with another. So when you observe something, you're immediately thinking about it, if you are. Yeah? And it's only your thinking that will draw threads of understanding between the various kinds of observation. When people demand a strictly objective science that it draw the content from observation alone, they must demand that science renounce all thinking. For thinking by its very nature goes over and above what has been observed. Now this is the moment, he says, to move from thinking to the being who thinks, who hasn't appeared on the board yet. Who's the being who thinks? Me, the thinker, yeah? For it is through the thinker that thinking is linked to observation. Now friends, this is the most gorgeous statement, one of the most gorgeous statements in the book. Yeah? The thinker is the one who's participating in these two activities. Yeah? Human consciousness is the stage where concept and observation meet and are connected to one another. Human consciousness is a stage where observation and thinking meet and are related to each other. That's what human consciousness is. I always wondered what human consciousness was. Yeah. Now, this is in fact what characterizes human consciousness. Human consciousness is the mediator between thinking and observation. Okay, now we begin to see something. So we could begin to do this. Yeah? Mediating between these two activities, there is the thinker. The thinker, therefore, exists in the field where these two activities are shared. My attention in one direction is turned toward observation, but then along with observation, my attention is turned in the other direction toward thinking. And so, who exists at this crossing point? Put your own name in there, yes? The thinker. The person who is observing and thinking appears in the middle of these two. Do we get it? Now friends, this is actually a eureka moment. You should all be standing on your chairs and applauding, because all of a sudden we understand where we are in this whole picture. We are the mediator between what we're observing and what we're thinking. And to the degree that we're conscious, we're either observing or we're thinking or we're doing both. Now to the degree that we're not conscious, we're not. We're not observing and we're not thinking, or we're probably sleeping, or we're whatever, yeah. We're not well. But to the degree that we are present, we are observing and thinking. Think about it. Yeah. So friends, I don't know if you could come up with a more elegant explanation of human consciousness than to say human consciousness is the mediator between thinking and observation. Wow. Completely accurate, without having to invent a whole lot of things. Yeah? It's completely true to our experience. Do you experience that? Yeah. Okay? So he says, to the extent that human beings observe things, things appear as given. To the extent that human beings think, they experience themselves as active. They regard things as objects. So we could say the percept could be an object. Yeah? Objects are out here. Yeah? The object of my observation. They regard things as objects, and they regard themselves as subjects. Here we are. As thinking subjects. Because we direct our thinking toward what we observe, we're conscious of objects. Because we direct our thinking to ourselves, we're conscious of ourselves, that is, we have self-consciousness. So self-consciousness is because we put our attention to ourselves, we become self-conscious. We can become conscious of an object, but we can also notice that we are being conscious of the object, yes? So we are self-conscious in our subjectivity. We're also conscious that we're not the object that we're observing. Yeah? I'm not the easel. I'm not the piece of art on the easel. I'm the one who's observing it. I am the subject, and what I'm looking at is the object, yeah, which is presenting itself to me as though it's separate from me. Now, because we direct our thinking to what we observe, we're conscious of objects. Because we direct our thinking to ourselves, we're conscious of ourselves. We have self-consciousness. Human consciousness must necessarily at the same time be self-consciousness, because it is a thinking consciousness. For when thinking directs its gaze toward its own activity, it has before it as its object its very own being, that is, its subject. My friends, that's a contemplation. That really is. But that statement, if you contemplate that statement very carefully, you realize the truth of what he's saying. Yeah. When thinking directs its gaze toward its own activity, it has before it as its object its very own being, that is, its subject. I am thinking. But we must not overlook that it is only with the help of thinking that we define ourselves as subject and contrast ourselves to objects. This is one of my favorite lines. Therefore, thinking must never be regarded as merely a subjective activity. Have you ever had someone say to you, so-and-so, your thinking is really subjective. It's all wrong. It's completely subjective. Your thinking is just subjective. Therefore, it's worthless. What an insulting thing to say. Yeah. So, he says, in fact, thinking is neither subjective nor objective, because it's thinking that distinguishes me as subject and distinguishes the content of what I'm observing as object. I don't distinguish myself. Thinking distinguishes me as subject and the rest of the world as object. Do we get it? Therefore, thinking is bigger than I am. I'm engaged in an activity that distinguishes me from the rest of the world. And I'm aware that I'm participating in it because I say, I am thinking, and I am observing. But thinking is running through all those statements, do you see? Do we get this, friends? It's just amazing what he's pointing out. He's pointing out that we are spiritually very active in this process. But thinking is in fact a universal activity that we're all subjectively participating in. Yeah. Thinking is beyond subject and object. Thinking forms both these concepts just as it does all others. Thus, when we as thinking subjects relate a concept to an object, we must not regard this relationship as merely something merely subjective. It is not the subject that introduces the concept to the object, but thinking. The subject does not think because it is a subject. Rather, the subject appears to itself as subject because it can think. These are contemplations, friends. Yeah. The activity that human beings exercise as thinking beings is therefore not merely subjective, but it is a kind of activity that is neither subjective nor objective. Thinking goes beyond both these concepts. Now, here we go. I should never say my individual subject thinks. Rather, I should say my individual subject lives by the grace of thinking. Do we get that? I say it all day long. I think this, I think that. Yeah? But in fact, if I was really honest about it, I should actually say, I exist because thinking distinguishes me from everything else. Do we get that? This is big. Are we having a little more respect for what thinking is? You know? Did we ever think about this kind of thing before? It's remarkable. Thinking is bigger than us. Thinking distinguishes us from the rest of the world. I should never say that I exist. I should only say that thinking distinguishes me from the rest of the world. And to that degree I exist, but I owe my existence to thinking. Friends, it's this kind of contemplation that led John to write the prologue to the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was a God. But it's this kind of recognizing the importance of this activity, which the Greeks called Logos, or the activity of this being who is in fact the one who distinguishes us from the rest of the world and lives in us. That was called Logos. Heraclitus said that. Yeah, Heraclitus recognized that, and John picked up on Heraclitus. But we could say this activity of experiencing ourselves as subject in the rest of the world actually is because we are participating in something which is bigger than us. And I actually live by the grace of thinking, rather than thinking lives by the grace of my doing it or not doing it. Yeah. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, we'd have to say that. So I should never say my individual subject thinks, rather my individual subject lives by the grace of thinking. That's on the top of page 53. Thus thinking is an element that leads me beyond myself and unites me with the objects. But thinking also separates me from them at the same time by setting myself over as subject. Just this establishes the dual nature of the human being. We think, and our thinking embraces ourselves with the rest of the world, but at the same time we also, by means of thinking, define ourselves as individuals standing over against the world as things. So one other way to say it would be that thinking distinguishes us and unites us with the world. Thinking distinguishes us from the world because we distinguish ourselves, because it distinguishes us as I. But thinking also unites us with the world because we can then find our meaningful relationship to it, to the rest of it, through thinking. So thinking separates us and unites us continually, distinguishing and uniting. A miracle. Now, next he says, so he's dealt with the nature of thinking, he's dealt with the thinker. The thinker is the I, is the self, that arises through the grace of thinking. And now he says we need to look at this other element, and the element that arises through observation. How it enters consciousness, where it encounters thinking. So he says, how does this enter into our consciousness? What's called the content of observation. He says, to answer this, we must purge our field of observation of everything that thinking has already brought to it. Difficult to do. For the content of our consciousness at any moment is already permeated by concepts in the most varied way. So try to imagine this, friends. We must imagine that a being with a fully developed human intelligence arises from nothing and confronts the world. They've never been here before, but all of a sudden a person appears in a body, a mature human being appears in a mature body, never having had a sense perception, never had any perception of the world at all. What would this being be aware of before it brought thinking into action? What it would experience is the pure content of observation because it hasn't had a chance to think about it yet. You with me? Mm-hmm. And the world would then reveal to this being only the pure relationless aggregate of sensory objects. Colors, sounds, sensations of pressure, warmth, taste, smell, and feelings of pleasure and displeasure. Those would be the experience that this mature human being had by all of a sudden awakening in the body and having the content of observation presented. Right?
That's great.
You with me? Yeah? Now, this aggregate is full of the pure thought-free observation. Over against it stands thinking, which is ready to unfurl its activity when a point of departure is found. Experience soon teaches that it is found. Thinking is able to draw threads from one element of observation to another. Thinking joins specific concepts to these elements and brings them into relationship with each other. We've already seen how a noise we encounter is linked with another observation, in which we characterize the former as an effect of the latter. If we recall that the activity of thinking should never be considered subjective, we will not be tempted to believe that such relationships established by thinking have merely subjective validity. It now becomes a question of discovering, through thinking contemplation, how the immediately given content of observation, the pure relationless aggregate of sensory objects, how it relates to our conscious subject. And now he says, because of shifting habits to speech, I have to coin a term, and that will be percept. So now he's introduced the term percept formally in chapter 4, on page 54, percept. He says, now, I will use percept to refer to the immediate objects of sensation, insofar as the conscious subject knows these objects only through observation. Thus it is not the process of observation, but the object of observation that I designate as the percept. The content, the object of observation. I've chosen not to use the term sensation because sensation has a specific meaning in physiology that's narrower than my concept of percept. I can characterize a feeling as a percept, but I can't characterize a feeling as a sensation. It's a psychological sense, yeah? Physiological sense. By its becoming a percept for me, I gain knowledge even of my feeling. And because we gain knowledge of our thinking too through observation, we can also call thinking as it first appears to our consciousness a percept. Now friends, he's going to bring a whole different picture now. So the naive person considers percepts as they first appear to be things that have an existence quite independent of the human being. We see a tree, we believe the tree in the form that we see it exists. Yeah? With its various colors. From this naive standpoint, if we see the sun appear in the morning as a disk on the horizon and follow the progress of the disk, we believe all this exists just as we observe it. We cling fast to this belief until we meet other percepts that contradict the first. The child with no experience of distances reaches for the moon. Did you remember doing that? Did you see your own children do that? No? How come I can't grab it? No, you can't distinguish the distance. You reach for it. Yeah. So, the child with no experience of distance reaches for the moon. Only when a second percept comes to contradict the first can the child correct what at first seemed real to it. Every extension of the sphere of my percepts makes me correct my image of the world. This is evident in daily life. The ancient image of the relation of the earth to the sun and other heavenly bodies was replaced by that of Copernicus because the ancient image did not agree with new, previously unknown percepts. When Dr. Franz operated on someone born blind, the person who had been awakened said that before his operation, he had arrived through the sense of touch at a very different image of the size of objects. Before he could see, he had a particular picture of the size of an object, but when he gained sight, he had to correct the impression that he had formed about the size. Interesting, isn't it?
Is it correct or readjust?
To correct or?
Readjust.
To adjust, yeah, to adjust.
It wasn't wrong.
That's right. Well, yeah, his new percept led him to correct the former, the percept that he had imagined, yeah. Or the percept that he had without sight changed when he gained sight. He had to correct his tactile percepts with his visual percepts. Yeah. His sense of touch and his sense of visual had to come into resonance with each other. Why are we continually compelled to correct our observations? A simple reflection provides the answer. If I stand at the end of an avenue, friends, remember, so I'm standing at the end of an avenue of trees, all right? The trees close to me are huge, and as I look down the avenue, they get smaller and smaller. And the interesting thing is, as I begin to walk down the avenue of trees, as I begin to walk, the trees that I'm passing are huge, but then they start, as I turn around, I notice that they're getting smaller, and the trees I'm walking toward are growing in size. You with me? So one, this goes back to Alice in Wonderland. One pill makes you bigger, one pill makes you small, and the ones that Mother gives you don't do anything at all. But you have this whole picture of Alice in Wonderland. Why is it that trees, all of a sudden, those trees down there that are only that tall, as I walk toward it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and pretty soon it's huge. And the ones I was walking away from, they shrink. This is Alice in Wonderland, isn't it? What a miracle this is. You got me? I mean, if we haven't formed concepts about it, we're all jaded because we got concepts. Of course, this is distance and perspective, you fool. Don't you know that? No. If I have just arrived on the planet and that happens to me and I've never formed any thoughts about what I'm perceiving, this is a miracle. How do these things grow so tall and how do those shrink behind me, you see? So we have to take the content of observation. We continually have to correct what we're observing by thinking about it. Yeah? You with me? So thinking is in fact helping us understand this amazing phenomena of the shrinking and growing of the trees. Yeah? It's only thinking that helps us understand it. Otherwise, we just imagine this world is complete magic. I don't understand any of it. Yeah? Complete miracle. In fact, the world is full of miracles, but this is one of them we really real through. So he says we need to realize, of course, we can then, through thinking, we'll realize that there are two reasons why the trees are getting taller or smaller. We begin to realize that standing at the end of the avenue, he says we have two factors. We have the qualitative experience of our being able to see different sizes, and we have the mathematical position of where we're observing the trees from. Yeah. So first of all, if I'm blind, I'm not going to have that phenomenon. If I'm nearsighted, I'm not maybe going to have, I'll have fuzzy phenomena. If I'm farsighted, it's slightly different. But if I can see the trees, my sight is working, then that's the qualitative phenomena. How well are my senses working is the first question. But the second question is, as I change my field of observation in my position in the relationship with the objects I'm perceiving, they shift. And he calls that the mathematical. He says it's not as significant, but he says we need, our relationship to what we're observing changes with distance. So these are the two factors that but you see, we'd never understand that merely through observation. We only would understand that by thinking about what we're observing. Otherwise, the world is always mushrooming right in front of us and shrinking behind us. Yeah. Pretty amazing. Yeah. How does it do that? So it's only by thinking about that we can do that. So now he said, friends, he has to introduce George Berkeley because Berkeley, when did Berkeley live? 1685 to 1753. If a tree falls in the forest, sorry to do this, but if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear the tree, does the tree make a sound? The falling tree make a sound? So what's the answer?
Yes.
Yes.
The true answer would be to Berkeley, what tree? What forest? Because Berkeley's whole point is, if there's nobody there to perceive it, there's nothing to perceive. He says there's nothing to perceive. So Berkeley is a theologian. Berkeley believes that God is in fact creating the world of objects on our behalf. Now if you think through his idea very carefully, you realize that God is an awfully busy fellow. Megas has to run around making sure that when we get to our car that that everything we left in the trunk is still there, and when we get home that all in our way home is creating the precepts of our home. So I mean, God is actually pretty busy if He's trying to arrange the entire world continually for each one of us our viewing pleasure. Can you imagine the problems He's having on the internet and trying to freeze all those images? So anyway, if Berkeley is actually correct, there's this amazing activity that God is doing. But Berkeley, as a theologian, is presuming that Berkeley doesn't think there are objects. Berkeley really says, bottom line is, there really are no objects in the world. They're only the percepts. They're only what we're given. And he says, unless the percept exists in the mind of a created being, that would be the observer, or in a divine being, there is no such object. In other words, God creates the appearance of things on our behalf. Now, from one perspective, you can understand as a theologian, yes, to say that God creates the world, yes. But to say that that easel ceases to exist the moment we leave the room, and if the room disappears because there's nobody in it, and nobody's thinking about it, is a stretch, right? How does it reappear tomorrow when we come back?
That's virtual reality.
That's virtual reality. It is exactly right. So, in a certain sense, Berkeley has taken. So, but the reason Berkeley has come to that, he says, Berkeley realizes that our percepts are partly subjective. They're related to the quality of our sensing and our position in relationship to it. But because he's a theologian, he assumes that God is creating those percepts on our behalf, solely for our behalf, and that they cease to exist if we're not perceiving them, unless they're held in the mind of a divine being or a human being. So please, God, don't forget my car, because I needed to get home. You know what I'm saying? So we have, in a certain sense, that's taking it. Well, it's taking Berkeley for who he is. Now, so he said, there's nothing to object to, on page 59, paragraph 21, there's nothing to object to this claim as long as it remains merely a general consideration of how the percept is partly determined by the organization of the subject. We have agreed that the subject, whether my eyes are working or not, and my position in space, do determine the quality of the percept and the size of the percept that I perceive. So the matter would appear different if we were in a position to describe the exact function of our perceiving in the origin of the percept. We would then know what happens to the percept during its being perceived. We could also determine what aspect of the percept must already exist before it's perceived. Now this is a real, friends, the interesting thing about the world is this, we're all taught that we all see the same thing, but we all think differently. That's completely backwards. In fact, we all see different things, but we all think the same way. That's why we can agree that that's an easel with a piece of art on it. I see it from my perspective. Each of you, from where you're sitting, views it from your own perspective. But the same object, we don't see it. If we were to pass a camera around, we would have 15 different objects. Yes? But we would find their similarity through thinking about them, and we'd realize, in fact, our thinking will make us agree that that's an object on the easel with colors on it. Yeah, the Peloponnesian Islands, perhaps, or beautiful blue and green and brown image. But on the other hand, you could say, so in fact, we don't see the same thing. We see things from our own particular individual subjective position. We see things subjectively, but we think universally. Wow! I told this to a person I was renting a car from, and it made his day. He said, wow, I'm going to think about that. Poor guy stuck at the counter, but he said, wow, that's exciting. So it really is exciting. We see the world subjectively because we see the world through our own particular eyes, with our own particular quality. And our position in relationship to what we're observing does qualify or limit what we perceive. But so far as we think about the thing, we think the same way. Otherwise, we'd never agree about anything. We couldn't even agree to disagree. So thinking is in fact a universal activity, but perceiving, the percept, is actually initially subjective. If I'm blind, I don't see that easel, nor do I see any of you. And if I'm outside the room and the door is locked and the windows are closed, neither do I see the object either. Yeah? So the percept is partly conditioned by the subject, but the concept that we relate to the percept, we relate through a universal activity of thinking. This is remarkable. It has to do also with Helen Keller and experience with her teacher. You all know the story of Helen Keller and her teacher, who was trying to sign into her, trying to give her some, because Helen Keller didn't have a sense of hearing or a sense of sight, and she was trying to somehow convey something to her. And finally, she was signing into her hand water, and she put her hand in water, and all of a sudden, wow! Yeah. So the idea and the percept came together for that moment, and boy, there was no stopping Helen Keller after that. She found an anchor point, and all of a sudden she began to realize what the relationship between these two things were. Yeah. So now he says, but we have to do one more thing. He says, with this, our investigation is directed away from the object of perception and back to the subject. Yeah? I do not perceive only things, I also perceive myself. So if I go to the Grand Canyon and I see the huge expanse, who's been to the Grand Canyon? Some of you, yeah, many of you, most of you, yeah. I haven't been there, but I can imagine. I try to imagine what it would be like. I've seen pictures. But you could say, if I could imagine going to the Grand Canyon, and when I stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon, if I get there this life, I'm going to notice that I'm standing at the end of the Grand Canyon. I'm at the Grand Canyon, but I also perceive that I'm in my body staring at it, you see? Mm-hmm. So along with the world that we're observing, we also observe that we are present. We observe that we are there witnessing it. No matter where I go on vacation, I can't get away from myself. Mm-hmm. Everywhere I go, there I am. I'm trying to get away. Yeah? So in other words, as a subject, I'm always aware that I am present, unless I can completely suspend self-perception and really put my full attention into what I'm observing. I'm usually aware that I am present observing this, along with what the rest of I'm observing. You with me? Mm-hmm. So we have a percept. So my subject is also a percept. Initially, it's a percept. What assists us in the sense of a percept of ourselves? There's a wonderful gift that we each given. What is it? That assists us in perceiving ourselves. This is a magnificent body. See, because we live in a body that has senses, we can perceive the presence of the body. Not only is the body the window to the world, but I can also perceive the body with the senses that I'm given by the body. So the body is in fact part of the subjective experience of myself, but it's not the full of it. I experience my body at the Red Grand Canyon. Yes, cold, wind is blowing, I'm hanging on for dear life. Whatever it may be. The sun is shining, I'm too hot. Whatever it may be. Yeah. But I can have the percept of my body. But that percept of my body assists me in giving an experience of myself because I also experience myself. However, friends, I have to do more than just have a percept of myself because a percept is only half of the experience. What's the other half of the experience?
Thinking. The concept.
The concept, you see? You've got it. That's exactly the point. So the percept is half the experience, but thinking allows me to find the concept that unites with the percept and helps me understand this is me standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon looking out over the rim. Okay? So thinking, so not only do I have a percept of my subject, but I also have to have a concept of my subject, a concept of myself. When does the concept of yourself dawn? How old are you? 3 years old, about 3 or 4, yes. When the child says, I, unless they're imitating someone else, which can happen. But when a child has the experience, I, and they say it, they have named themselves, they have been living for 3 years with the percept of their body and tremendous number of experiences and also a tremendous number of concepts, but the sense of the concept of self doesn't dawn until about 3. Yeah? Which means that the sense of self is entering into the body, gradually using the body, and only around the age of 3 does the concept of the self dawn. Amazing, isn't it? So even the subject is a percept initially given to the body, partly, but I also have a percept of my memories. I have a percept of my biography. I can tell you if you have some time, but you don't want to. So each of us has a percept of our biography, a whole history of our subject. Whole history of our subjective experiences, but only back to about age 3. I can't tell you much before that except what people have said. Now, so friends, this experience of the subjectivity of ourself, he says, on the one hand, in the last chapter, he said, when I gaze at a tree and I notice that it's a redwood, when I leave the tree, when I'm no longer gazing upon the tree, what's left is the conceptual counterpart, the idea. There's a redwood tree. I no longer see the object, but now I can carry the idea of redwood around with me. There's a redwood tree in a particular spot. However, here he's saying there's more than just the idea. There is also a visual memory of, or some kind of sensory impression that I have attached in the moment that I have united a percept with a concept. I have connected 2 things, and I retain reference to both of them. I have actually formed a mental picture. And a mental picture belongs to me. Nobody else has a mental picture that I have, nor should they. Each of us has our own mental picture. So a mental picture actually belongs to the thinker. Friends, this is magic. It's really magic. But you could say a mental picture is the content of our memory. Yeah? So not only can I say that I came from Fair Oaks and Rudolf Center College, but I can describe the campus of Rudolf Center College. You can describe your home to me, yes? Now, I can try to form a mental picture from what you're telling me, but until I actually have a percept of your particular house, I'm going to form an imagination. I'll form a picture, but really it would be, if you have a photo of it or an image, that will help me sharpen my own mental picture. But the mental picture belongs to the subject. Each of us has our own mental pictures because each of us has our own individual experiences of observing and thinking. You can live right next to somebody. You can live in the same household for years and years and years and have a very different mental picture of the world, even though you've had the same experiences. You see? So our biographies are very individualized. They're individualized because not only do we've experienced, we've seen different things, and we've seen them subjectively, we also, although we're thinking universally, we're thinking about our subjective perceptions, and we have formed particular pictures, and along with them, friends, we also have, as a part of this, I'm going to stick it in here just because it helps us get through the course, we also have our feelings. Feelings are part of the percept of myself, along with my memories. Feelings are my subjective response to either what I'm perceiving or thinking. We're going to come to that later on, but I just thought it would help here. So along with the mental picture is this a happy memory, an unhappy memory? Do I like this image or am I dissatisfied with it? We have our joys and our failures, our triumphs and our sorrows. So we can say our mental pictures, our biography, are filled with tremendous richness, and along with them are also our feelings about them. I wish this had never happened. I'm so glad that I got a chance to do this. You see? But that's their feeling experience. That's also that. Now, does anybody else have our feeling experience? No. The feeling experience is completely subjective. However, can we convey those feelings to somebody else? Yes, we can. And in fact, what a joy when someone else understands what we feel. Someone else understands how we think. when we can share our biography with each other, wow, we can begin to build bridges. You have a new picture of a person when they tell their biography. Oh my gosh, you've been through amazing experiences. Wow. I revere you for having gone through all that and survived so beautifully and so intact. I'm serious. A miracle, yeah? So, we're beginning to get a picture of the human being, friends. Remember the first question he asked? Can we know ourselves well enough that we can gain certainty about our relationship to the world? Are we beginning to build a picture here a little bit? Yeah. Okay. Now, so he says, I perceive mental pictures in myself in the same way that I perceive colors in objects. You with me? Middle of page 60.
Thank you.
Middle of page 60. I perceive mental pictures in myself. When I'm observing a mental picture, I'm not gazing into space. I may be gazing into space, but I'm not seeing the mental picture as a product of space. I'm seeing the mental picture as a subjective projection of my memory. It's my own picture that I'm projecting. My mental picture is my mental picture. Yeah? And every one of us has our own. Now, he says, so I can begin to say, just as I can perceive colors outside me in objects, I can perceive mental pictures within me as the content of my subject. Now, from this point of view, I can now make a distinction. I can call the objects that stand over against me the outer world, the world of colors that I perceive on the wall, and I can distinguish between those and those, the content of my self-percept as my inner world. Now this seems subtle. It's not that subtle. It's actually pretty clear. Yeah. So the colors that we're surrounded by in this room, the beautiful colors we're surrounded by in this room, are a part of our outer world. But within that, we also have our rich experiences that belong to each of us from within. We could say we have our inner world, and we have the world spread out through our senses, which is the outer world. Now, friends, he makes this outrageous statement. Failure to recognize the relationship between the mental picture and the object. We can all distinguish between what belongs to me, can't you? I mean, I have a mental picture of my rental car in the parking lot. I hope it's still there. But when I actually get there, I won't know that it's really there until I can perceive it as an object. Yeah, there it is. Hallelujah. I hope. So the object is not. I don't carry the object around with me except as a picture. But the picture belongs within me. It's a part of my inner picture. It's kind of embarrassing when you rent a car and you don't remember what kind of car it was. It's happened, believe me. Okay, which one do you want? My goodness, thank goodness they had those little buzzers now. They little things that you can push, buttons you can push that will honk the horn. Oh, that's so. But if I only had the mental picture is not the object. The mental picture is a part of my inner world. And I would say the object that I'm perceiving through my senses belongs to the outer world. Do we get that? Now he says the failure to distinguish between these two worlds has led to the greatest misunderstandings in philosophy. Okay? Now he's attacking somebody here. Who is he attacking? He's attacking Immanuel Kant and everybody who's fallen prey to the subtle genius and extremely convincing arguments of this tremendous genius, Immanuel Kant. However, Rudolf Steiner has to say, I'm sorry, Immanuel, great try, but you blew it here, you see. So this is where we're going. So failure to recognize the relationship between the mental picture and the object, yes, has led to the greatest misunderstandings in modern philosophy. The perception of an interchange, the modification that myself undergoes, has been thrust into the foreground, and the object causing this modification has been lost sight of altogether. It has been said we do not perceive objects, but only our mental pictures. Does this sound familiar? You think that you're living in a world of objects, but really it's only your picture of the world that you've got. We've all got our own picture. Well, yes, we each have our own picture, but do we disagree about an object being present? We might. But, so I'm not supposed to know anything about the object of my observation, the table in itself, but only about the change that occurs in myself when I perceive the table. I'm supposed to know only my mental picture of the table, but not the table as a thing in itself. Now friends, this word, a thing in itself, is the invention of Immanuel Kant. A thing in itself is a problem. Yeah. It's a title. It's another title like the given and the not given. But a thing in itself, we have to take this to task. A thing in itself would exist complete without any other hook into it. A thing in itself would exist without anything. So in other words, what Immanuel Kant has really said was that all I have of the object, when I gaze at a chicken, I don't get a chicken in my eyeball, I don't get a chicken in my brain, I only get an image of a chicken. If I had a chicken in my brain, that would lead to fuzzy thinking. See with me? So I don't really know the object of the chicken, all I know is the image of the chicken. So the mental image of the chicken is all I really know. I don't really know the object at all. Now, yes, to some degree, but wait a minute, there's a problem here, you see? So to say that I don't know the chicken at all, I only know the impression that the chicken makes, is half-baked. There's something missing here. Yeah? The Steiner's got to take this to task. So, now he says, we have to say that this is not what Berkeley said. Berkeley doesn't think there are any objects. Okay, Berkeley is in his own planet. We'll just leave Berkeley to the side. But this is the point of view of Kant. Yeah? Kant limits our knowledge, page 61, lower paragraph. This limits our knowledge. Kant's view limits our knowledge of the world to our mental pictures, but it does so. But it does not do so because of the conviction that no things except the mental pictures can exist. Rather, Kant believes us to be so organized that we can only learn of the modifications in ourselves, not of the things in themselves that cause the mental pictures to arise. From the circumstance that I only know my mental pictures, Kant draws the conclusion that there is no existence independent of the mental pictures. Not that there is no existence, but that the subject cannot receive such an existence into itself. I can't take the chicken into my brain. Therefore, I'll never know the chicken as a chicken in itself. I can imagine the chicken being fuzzy with its feathers. When you pluck them, it's not as fuzzy. But it's still, I can't put the plucked chicken in my brain either, you see? So therefore, the chicken as a thing in itself, all I get of the chicken is my image, my mental picture of the chicken. I never get the chicken in the brain. Thank goodness, right? That would be unhealthy. So, but this is a problem, friends. It's a problem philosophically. Because it doesn't really, it pushes the object as unknowable, and it focuses only on the images that we're dealing with. It's never going to get us back to the real world. We're living in the world of, this is Alice in Wonderland. Yeah, I'm living in a wonder world where things get smaller and bigger, and I have no idea why that's happening. Yeah? So yeah. So in other words, I'm only living in the world of my pictures of the world. I don't know the world at all. Yeah, we've heard that before. I don't know the world at all. Now, if we become convinced of this, this can be actually a terrifying state. We can actually come into an existential crisis if we can only think, I don't really know the world. The world is completely my illusion, and I'm only living in this world, and this is a game, and I don't understand it, and all I know is my impressions of it, and wow, who's crazier here than I am? Yeah? So it can lead us to that state. Now, but he says, Kant, he's got to give Kant to us clearly. Immanuel Volkelt wrote a book, and Steiner's quoting from Kant, from Volkelt, who's introducing Kant's worldview, middle of page 62. The first fundamental proposition that the philosopher must bring to clear consciousness consists in the recognition that our knowledge does not initially extend beyond our mental pictures. Our mental pictures are the only things we know directly, right? Experience directly, and just because we experience mental pictures immediately, even the most radical doubt cannot tear us from our knowledge of our mental pictures. By contrast, the knowledge that goes beyond our mental pictures, I use this expression in the widest sense, so it includes all psychical, all soul events, is not safe from doubt. Hence, at the start of philosophizing, all knowledge that goes beyond mental pictures must be explicitly posited as open to doubt. Wow, what kind of philosophy is this that leads me to the existence of what I could up until now considered to be reality? I thought the objects did exist. You're telling me that the objects that I perceive don't exist as I perceive them, but they only are mental pictures, and what? You mean I don't really have a car in the parking lot? You mean I'm not really in the classroom? So all of a sudden we're in a nightmare. We should begin to feel the ground dropping from under our feet. There is no ground. Now, this is how Bokel's book, A Manual of Concept Epistemology, begins. What's presented as if it were an immediate and self-evident truth is really the result of the following kind of thought process. The naive human being believes that objects as we perceive them exist outside human consciousness. But now, Kant goes on to say, but physics, physiology, and psychology seem to teach that our organization is necessary for our perceptions, and that consequently we cannot know anything about things other than what our organization transmits to us. Hence, our percepts are modifications of our organization and not things in themselves. Edward von Hartmann characterizes this train of thought as necessarily leading to the conviction that we can have direct knowledge only of our mental pictures. Because we find outside our organism vibrations of bodies and of the air that appear to us as sound, this view reasons that what we call sound is nothing more than a subjective reaction of our organization to these vibrations in the outer world. We don't know that sound really exists. We only know that we perceive sound, but we don't know if sound really exists. Okay. There are vibrations in the air that we can measure, and what we call sound is probably those vibrations. But we don't know what those vibrations really are. We just know our subjective experience of what we call sound. So, in the same way, color and warmth are only modifications of our organism. According to this view, the percepts of warmth and color are evoked in us as the effects of processes in the outer world that are different than our experience of warmth and color. When these processes stimulate the nerves in my skin, I have the subjective percept of warmth. When these processes stimulate my optic nerve, I perceive light and color. Now friends, he's cut to the chase at the bottom of the page. The specific nerve sense energy is proposed by Jane Mueller. According to this theory, our senses have the peculiar quality that each sense responds to all external stimuli with only one specific fashion. If a stimulus is applied to an optic nerve, the percept of light arises. Whether the excitation occurs through what we call light, or through mechanical pressure, or through an electrical current impinging on the nerve. In other words, I can gaze at a source of light and experience light. I can also close my eye and press on my eye and experience light. I can also take a piece of wire and probe the optic nerve and pass a mild electric current, and I will have the experience of light. So light doesn't really exist except as a stimulus exciting my optic nerve. That's the conclusion. What I think is light is in fact just a stimulus affecting my sense of sight. I don't know what light is. The same. Now, the kicker is, if I do the same thing to the auditory nerve, I can hear sound as a mechanical pressure, a mechanical thing. I can press on my ears and also hear sound, and I can put the wire in and stimulate the optic nerve, the auditory nerve, and pass a mild electric current, and I'll hear sound. So sound is nothing more than a stimulus exciting my auditory nerves. I don't know what sound is at all. You with me? So the same thing that stimulates the optic nerves gives me light, that same stimulating my auditory nerves gives me sound. Therefore, light and sound don't exist as I think that they do. All I have is my subjective impression of light and sound. I don't know what light is. I don't know what sound is. I only know my subjective experience I only know my mental picture. That's the conclusion. You with me? So I don't know what light and sound are as things in themselves. Yes? I only know my subjective experience of light and my subjective experience of sound, which is conditioned by my senses. In fact, because my senses live at the boundary of of this source where the object comes into touch with something that I call myself, it's where the senses are. I don't know what actually exists beyond my senses. All I know that the senses are stimulated and I have a mental picture arise. But I don't know what is really stimulating them in truth. But friends, do you begin to feel more and more alienated from the world?
Yes.
This is completely spectator consciousness. We're pulled back and pulled back and pulled back into our own sense of self. We're all living in our own little cocoon. And we don't even know if the person next to us is real. Yes, or maybe they're just an excitation of the optic nerve, or maybe it's something I had for supper. How do I know? You know what I'm saying? So we begin to live in the sense that each one of us is locked up in the world of mental pictures, and we don't know what our relationship to reality is. We're confirmed that we can know our mental pictures, but we're completely shunted from the idea that our mental pictures have anything to do with the world that we think we're observing. There was a movie made of this idea. Remember the name of the movie?
Matrix?
The Matrix. The Matrix was based on this basic idea. Yeah? The world is an illusion. We're all just being roasted on a spit by aliens, and we're being given stimuli into our senses that make us feel like we're all living in this world, in this beautiful room. Yes, but in fact, we're just, we don't really know what's going on. The aliens have invaded us and we're being taken. You see, but the Matrix is just a popularization of this point of view. Okay?
So the Matrix is modern Kant?
Yes, it is. It's modern Kant, isn't it? Completely. Yeah. Now, so Steiner has. He says, let's take if we're gazing at the red object on the wall, the red chalk going on the wall. So he says, if we take this theory completely clear, you say, we think we see red chalk on the wall, but in fact, we don't really get that, because all we really get is something stimulating we get light somehow. First, let's take the eye as a sense organ, okay? Mm-hmm. The eye is a marvelous sense organ. We're all told somewhere in our early education that the eye has this beautiful lens and iris and so forth. And what's the first thing that the eye does? If this is a candle, here's a candle burning. Yeah. What's the first thing that the eye does when it takes that in? It turns it upside down. That should always lead us to be suspicious. Yeah. The first thing that the eye does is it inverts the image. Oh my gosh! What I think is a candle with the flame burning up is in fact is presented to me as a candle with the flame burning down. Wait a minute, that's fishy, Plus, that it has to pass through this so-called funny water, the aqueous humor, So there's fluid in the eye as well, which is also doing something weird to the thing. So the image is inverted, it's passing through this fluid. Now the theory is that the back of the eye is our cells, which are some which are sensitive to shape and some which are sensitive to color. Rod and cone cells, they're called. And the rod and cone cells are arranged in our eyeball, and each one of them is coated with a kind of a chemical called visual purple. And the visual purple is light sensitive. So each of these rod and cone cells has its own chemical coating of visual purple, and the inverted image stimulates and changes the chemical process. So that visual purple is a chemical reaction to an inverted image of light. Okay? That's the second strike. And the first strike was it turns the image upside down. Second of all, the light image is now converted to a chemical process. The third strike is the chemical process is then transmitted into the cell as an electrical charge. Okay? And the electrical charge is gathered up by the little filaments in each one of the cells, and all those little filaments form what's called the optic nerve, which goes back and connects with the part of the brain. Okay? So, I think I'm gazing at a candle. am I naive or what? You see? So this point of view, the idea that the candle exists as I perceive it, is called naive realism. And the point of view of Volkelt and Kant and von Hartmann is naive realism is in fact really stupid, naive. Yeah? So naive realists don't call themselves naive realism, don't call themselves naive realists, they're called that as a scathing term. To say, you think that that really exists as you perceive it, boy, are you really a fool. How naive of you. Now, so the naive realist says, yes, that exists as I see it, but the other point of view is that if you watch what happens to that object on the way into your brain, it's completely demolished and converted. A light process is changed to a chemical process, which is changed to an electrical process, which somehow is transmitted to the brain. Now, where is the color? Suppose it's a red candle. Yeah? This is a red candle with a yellow flame. Okay? So where do I see? So I said, I think that I'm looking outside me at a red candle with a yellow flame. But in fact, that inverted image in light is converted to a chemical process, and so I don't really find, I really don't see red out there. I'm only seeing red on here. But in fact, where is the red there? Because the red isn't the light. The red is changed to a chemical process. The chemical process is changed to an electrical process. The electrical process is transmitted by the optic nerve to the brain, and then the brain somehow sends the whole thing back out through the eye, and I imagine that I'm seeing a red candle with a yellow flame. Amazing!
Miraculous.
Isn't this amazing, friends? This is Alice in Wonderland. This is the world we're supposed to live in, according to this point of view, right?
Yeah.
So, now we have to start over again, because we realize, wait a minute, I don't see red anywhere. Where is red? Is red merely the process of my brain projecting something out? I don't know that the red object exists at all with the yellow flame. Where is red in this whole process? It's not really in the object. Is it in my eye? Is it in my brain? Is it in the optic nerve? Where is it? So all we have is a projected mental picture. I think I'm gazing at a red candle with a yellow flame. Actually, friends,
Not thinking.
I don't know what it is. I don't know nothing. Now, this is a problem. Now, Steiner says, it would be hard to find, so this is a beautiful statement here. It would be hard to find another edifice of thought, bottom of 66, in the history of human culture that has been constructed with more ingenuity, but nevertheless on close scrutiny collapses into nothing. Let's look closely at how this edifice has been built up. It begins with what was given to naive consciousness of the thing perceived. Then it shows us that everything found there would be non-existent if we had no senses, no eye, no color. Okay? So color is not yet present in what affects the eye. It first arises through the interaction of the eye with the object. But therefore the object is colorless. But color is not present in the eye. In the eye there's a chemical or physical process that's led through the nerve to the brain, where it sets off another process. The process is still not color. It is only through the brain process that the color is evoked in the soul. Therefore, it still does not yet enter my consciousness, but is first transferred outward by the soul onto a body. Finally, I think I'm perceiving it there. We have come full circle. We become conscious of the colored body. That comes first. Now the thought operation begins. If I had no eyes, the body would be colorless for me. Therefore, I cannot attribute color to the body. I go looking for it. I look for it in the eye in vain. I look for color in the nerve in vain. And I look for the color in the brain in vain. Where is the color? Yeah. Finally, I look for it in the soul. There I find it, to be sure, but unconnected to the body, unconnected to the object. I find the colored body only where I began. The circle has been closed. I recognize as a product of my soul what the naive human being imagines as externally present in space. Now this is the true picture of we live in a world of Maya and illusion. This is a beautiful example. He says, it seems to fit beautifully. He says, but let's start at the beginning. He says, wait a minute, there's a problem here. The problem is, remember that the naive realist thinks that the object exists as we perceive it. But this other point of view, which is called critical idealism, says if you're not naive but critical, And if you're not a realist, but you realize that this is really the product of a whole series of ideas, you're a critic. This is called critical idealism. Critical idealism is basically saying to assume that an object exists as you perceive it is foolish, because this is a proof that the object you think exists is in fact merely a fabrication of your own processes. However, the process of argument falls apart in this way. The naive realist, or the critical idealist, wants to disprove that that thing exists as we perceive it, but it assumes that the eyeball is real as we perceive it. Whoops, forgot about that. And it perceives that the aqueous humor and the inverted light image exist as they're perceived. Whoops, never mind, well, forget that. And it assumes that the visual purple and the process, the chemical process, exist as we perceive them. Well, okay. And that the electrical charges somehow that we imagine are going on are somehow also connected with the fact that we can see nerve fibers connecting to the brain. In other words, we assume, we're trying to use critical idealism to discount the reality of objects naive realists think it exists, but the proof that we're using is to look at the object as a naive realist does, to look at the senses as a naive realist does. You can't have it both ways, you see? So what he's going to conclude from this, friends, is critical idealism, whether critical idealism is correct, is one thing, but the power of this proof to convince us, we should be really suspect of this, right? In other words, if we're trying to say the naive realist is so stupid to think that the object exists as it exists, but then to assume that the eye and all the processes exist as we perceive them is just as naive. Therefore, critical idealism has just lost the battle, you see? Its power to convince us is completely flawed. It's like tugging the one card from under the house of cards, all of a sudden the whole thing collapses. So he's not going to completely discount the idea of critical idealism. He says, but the power of this argument to convince us of its truth is certainly zero. None of us should walk out of the room thinking that this point of view has been won. Okay? But we should walk out of the room. So good morning, everybody. I'm so glad that you have come back, because chapter 4 is the worst chapter in the book. Chapter 4 has the worst reputation. The Philosophy of Freedom used to really be considered an incredibly difficult book. It's still a pretty difficult book. But fortunately, 100 years have passed since it was written. And just like the fairy tale, you know, a spell is cast by the evil godmother, you know, the unhappy godmother casts a spell and puts a growth over the castle, and the princess is put to sleep for 100 years, and not until the 100 years have passed can a person kind of find access to the castle, kiss the princess, wake her up, and everything will be fine again. So in a certain sense, the Philosophy of Freedom and all of Rudolf Steiner's work, we're benefiting from the fact that we're almost 100 years away from most of it. And so the book was written in 1893. In 1993, we actually had a celebration at Rudolf Steiner College to celebrate the centenary, the 100-year anniversary of the writing of the book. And I actually found, I've taught the book since 1981. But to be honest with you, trying to teach the book that you don't completely understand is not a very easy thing to do. So I've had a chance to work with it over 100 times, with over 100 different groups of people over the years. But it became much easier after 1994. After 100 years had passed, all of a sudden, the book became much more accessible. And where it was spoken about with kind of hushed tones, oh, the philosophy of freedom, you know, it's an untouchable, there's no way to scale that mountain. That's not the case anymore. It's much more accessible, it's much more open. And, but the worst chapter in the book, the chapter which has everybody throwing the book against the wall, is chapter 4, which we have almost successfully come through. So congratulations, and you're still here and still smiling, that's good. So chapter 4, the world is per se. The reason Rudolf Steiner has to lead us into these two points of view, the point of view primarily of critical idealism and of naive realism, is that these are points of view which they actually continue to live today. There are people who still, I mean, scientists will say to most of us, you're so foolish. You think the world is as you perceive it. But we know from physiology and psychology that the world that we see is in fact not exactly the way we see it at all. It consists of atoms, and the atoms are actually the spaces between them, and what we consider to be a solid body and so forth is not solid at all. There are atoms, and the atoms are separated by space, and the particles of the atoms are separated by space, and anything that we consider to be solid is in fact not really solid. So we can begin to question from the point of view of naive realism, what is it that we're actually seeing? But the way we go about it is also then to try to build a mechanism, a kind of mechanical or electrical or chemical hypothesis about what happens to, for instance, to an image as we take it into our eye. We went through that last night, yes. We invert the image, it's translated from a light image to a chemical process to an electrical charge that somehow is transmitted to the brain. The missing gap, the gap in this argument, of course, is also where is the soul? The soul is mentioned, but the soul, what is it? So there's no attempt really to define what the soul is. Somehow the soul sends the impulse from the brain back out to the object, and we see the object and so forth. But in a certain sense, we have to kind of go through these different points of view because they still haunt us to this very day. And so Rudolf Steiner's main concern is he says we cannot clarify the relationship between the mental picture and the percept by using the idea of critical idealism.